about Seth.
I am going to talk about Seth. So let me start by saying that I'm both sad and glad that I'm coming after Kim. Sad because she did such a lovely job, and I don't know if it's going to stand up to the same degree, but glad that she at least set the precedent that I can read. This has been too much in flux for me to have felt like I've got it completely in my head to just talk it, so I'm going to have to read it. Let me say as another prefatory phrase, I think I'm going to be going against the gist of just about everyone's understanding in the room of the the opportunistic and eliminative harming idea. So that, in some sense, that's kind of at the core of what this paper is about. In another sense, it's about whether Seth's ultimate thesis can be defended. And I think actually it can. I'm going to offer some thoughts at the end about how it can, but I don't think it can be defended in the way that Seth tries to defend it. So here we go. Defending the following principles, the central aim of Seth Lazar's book, Sparing Civilians. The principle is moral distinction. In war, with rare exceptions, killing non-combatants is worse than killing combatants. I believe Seth is right. Killing non-combatants is, with rare exceptions, worse than killing combatants. But I believe he is wrong to think that this generalization does much to support the ultimate aim of his book, which is to support the principle that killing targeted, innocent, unjust combatants can be permissible, this is by the way a quote, but that targeting innocent, unjust non-combatants, normally is not. I'm pausing now because there's a handout. I forgot that. There it is. Actually, let's divide that in two and send it around both sides. All right. Nothing is not prepared with paper. Okay. So the quotes here, moral distinction, and what I'm about to describe are under introduction on the handout. The principle of moral distinction is comparative, but the ultimate conclusion regarding permissibility, which I would call threshold distinction, is not. Lazar's argument, I say, fails to make the transition from a comparative to a threshold principle in a convincing way, and as a result, it fails in its ultimate aim. The problem, I believe, arises at two levels. On one level, the problem is that Lazar, Seth, fails to argue for the premise that he relies on to make the transition, this is how I reconstruct the argument, to make the transition from moral distinction to threshold distinction. The premise is, quote, that pacifism is false. If we grant him the assumption that fighting wars, just wars, are permissible, then his argument is essentially this. Again, my reconstruction. If we have to kill some people to fight a just war, then we should kill those whom it is less bad to kill. This is quite plausible. The problem, however, is that the deontological framework that Seth adopts makes it clear that this assumption needs defense, for it could be that even if targeting combatants is less bad than targeting non-combatants, it's still impermissible, but the needed defense goes wanting. Although I think it's a deeper level, I suspect the problem is embedded by a general tendency in Seth's book to approach deontological reasoning in a comparative framework of better and worse actions, where a worse action is defined as one that is, quote, more seriously fact-relative wrongful than another. While I accept that there are ways in which one wrongful action can be more seriously fact-relative wrongful than another, the relevance of that is, I think, limited. It may matter for things like the degree of blame due an agent who acts wrongly, or what to do if duties conflict, as they might if it was obligatory to fight a just war. It will not, however, be relevant to the central concern of deontology, determining whether an act is permissible. I'll proceed as follows. First section, I'll explain the core structure of Seth's argument, again, as I understand it. Second, I will explain why Seth should not have felt himself free to assume that pacifism is false. Third, and at most length, I'm going to discuss his treatment of opportunistic and eliminative killing. Then I'm going to discuss briefly his treatment of risky killing. And finally, I'm going to indulge myself by offering a quick pass at an alternative theory that might succeed better than Seth's at defending threshold distinction. Okay, so the core of the argument. Maybe I don't have to go through this because you all read it, but I guess since it's my reconstruction, I should do it. So Seth takes as his starting point that people have a right to life, and in particular, a right not to be killed. But this right is not absolute. Or as I prefer to put it, people have a claim not to be killed that has to be weighed against competing claims, and that sometimes is outweighed in the final analysis. The question is there a reason to think that combatants' claims not to be killed often lose in such a way that they may be targeted for killing without violating their rights, while also thinking that non-combatants may rarely be targeted for killing? One might seek to provide an affirmative answer to this question in one of two familiar ways, particularly salient in war. One, the person can do something in virtue of which he is liable to be killed. Two, his claims can simply lose out in the balance as a lesser evil. Lesser evil justifications may work when people are killed as a side effect of some legitimate targeting decision, but they seem problematic as a justification for the targeted killing of those who are not liable to being killed. If targeted killing is to be justified, it seems that liability is the most plausible way to go. But Seth argues that liability also cannot be used to defend threshold distinction. My label, not his. To argue that liability cannot be used to defend threshold distinction, Seth relies on two observations. First, he points out that conceptions of liability can use a higher or lower threshold for determining when a person is liable to be killed. Second, he observes and defends what he calls the overlap hypothesis. That is on your syllabus, on your handout. Got me. I guess at some point in my brain I'm thinking about next semester's teaching. Okay.
Is this on the exam?
Yes. Yes. But the exams pass, fail, and besides, I won't know who you are. A morally significant proportion of non-combatants are as responsible as a morally significant proportion of combatants for contributions to unjustified threats. That's the overlap hypothesis. So Seth offers a number of reasons to accept the overlap hypothesis. In the interest of time, I'm not going to mention them. I'm just going to say they seem basically right to me. But these two observations lead to the following problem for the use of a liability criterion as a basis for threshold distinction, and here I'm quoting. If we make the liability threshold low enough to ensure that all unjust combatants are liable, we will make too many unjust combatants liable as well. If we endorse a high threshold of responsibility for liability, then we will find that too few unjust combatants are liable. The first would radically undermine the protection of non-combatants in war. The second would leave us without legitimate means to fight otherwise just wars. And there's no Goldilocks position. So this sets a challenge. How else could one maintain the protection of most non-combatants in war while also preserving the moral permissibility of fighting a just war? Seth's answer? By arguing that, quote, killing innocent civilians is worse than killing innocent soldiers, end quote. That is by defending moral distinction. Now, at first this seems like a non sequitur to me. As I pointed out in the introduction, it could be that moral distinction is true, but that it is nonetheless impermissible to kill unjust combatants because they are not sufficiently liable to be killed. But if Seth is entitled to the premise that we must be free to fight just wars, then we move into a space where comparative wrongness might matter. Right? Given the assumptions, A, that a particular just war should be waged, B, that if it should be waged, it should be waged effectively, C, and that fighting a war effectively is possible only if the military aims to kill people, we can conclude that the military fighting such a just war should aim to kill some people. Given that the military should aim to kill some people, it's reasonable to conclude that it should choose the lesser evil and target those whom it is less bad to kill. Note, this is not a pure or traditional lesser evil justification. It's not a justification simply in terms of saying that targeting combatants produces more good than not doing so. It's a kind of conditional lesser evil justification. Given that a just war should be fought, one should kill those whom it is less bad to kill. Part 2, the problem with assuming that pacifism is false. So the problem with Lazar's argument, there it is that the condition on which it rests, that just wars should at least sometimes be fought, cannot simply be assumed if one accepts that deontological restrictions limit the permissible pursuit of the good, including the good of justice. Seth himself agrees that we must look to the ideas, quote, at the heart of deontological, moral, and political philosophy, end quote, to understand the principles governing permissible harm. And any deontologist would accept, for example, that there are circumstances in which one may not kill one person even if doing so would prevent 5 other equally grave killings. Sometimes the rights of others bind one, and one must act neither to minimize rights violations nor to protect oneself from unjust attacks. Thus, one cannot simply assume that it is permissible to attack those whom it is least bad to kill, if in fact they are not liable to being attacked. Seems to me the most obvious response to this objection is that deontological restrictions are not absolute. They yield when a certain threshold of harming or wronging would otherwise occur. Even the core deontological restriction against using people as a means of bringing about a greater good and thereby killing them without their consent is the sort of thing that most deontologists would say can be overridden if the cost of not killing in that way is high enough. Moreover, it seems reasonable to say that the threshold level of a good required to justifiably override a deontological restriction is higher if the deontological restriction is stronger. So if some acts are worse wrongs than others, then one might think that a greater good must be achieved to justify them. If so, then Seth's moral distinction could work perfectly well in the space of threshold deontology. While I admit that this is a logically consistent answer to my challenge, I find it substantively implausible. I think it's important to be clear about the difference between, and this is on the handout, under section 2, distinguish A from B. The difference between justifiably treating a claim as outweighed by competing considerations, in which case contravening it does not wrong the person, and B, justifiably thinking that a person has a right that may not be violated, while also thinking that the good at stake is so great that it cannot justifiably be forsaken. For example, I think that turning a trolley from 5 onto 1 does not wrong the one. His claim not to be killed in that context is outweighed and no right of his is violated. By contrast, to use someone as a means of stopping a trolley violates his fundamental right not to be used as a means without his consent at great cost to him. If he must be used to save, say, 1,000 lives, then the good at stake may call for using him as a means despite his right not to be so used. But I think his right not to be so used persists. Using him still wrongs him. This is, I'm aware, a controversial view about threshold deontology. Nonetheless, I think it answers to a deep truth about the role of rights in morality, and I'm happy to talk about that afterwards if people want. In assuming that it is correct, it shows that there is something wrong with the appeal to the space of threshold deontology. While targeting people in war is a grave matter not to be pursued lightly, if it is justifiable, it should not normally be treated as a matter of violating the rights of some for the sake of a greater good. Rather, it is justifiable in the same way that turning the trolley from 5 onto 1 is justifiable. Holding that it wrongs those who are justifiably killed, holding that it wrongs those who are justifiably killed, gets the substantive morality wrong. The alternative answer for Seth is to appeal to the possibility that there's a difference in the sorts of deontological justifications that can be offered for targeting and killing combatants and non-combatants. If such a difference can be found, then we can defend threshold distinction, but the justifications offered would have to be deontologically robust. It will not do to argue that killing non-combatants is worse than killing combatants, while assuming that it is permissible to kill those that it is least bad to kill. The permissibility of killing some is what we are seeking to justify. The argument must go directly to establishing threshold distinction. This point is not itself a deep criticism of Seth's argument. If his arguments in the later chapters can be reframed as robust deontological arguments, then his overall project would still succeed. But I will argue in the next 2 sections that his arguments do not work, in part because they are too focused on making comparative claims, and that they cannot be recast in any straightforward ways of making threshold claims. If that's true, then Seth's overall argument fails. Section 3, the long section. Problems with Seth's treatment of opportunistic and limited harming. So let me say before I get into this section, I may have an idiosyncratic and indefensible interpretation of opportunistic versus eliminative harming here. If so, then my whole argument may fall on his face. But here's how I read what's going on. So Seth thinks that the distinction between opportunistic and eliminative harming is deontologically significant, and that it helps explain why killing non-combatants is generally worse than killing combatants. I agree that the distinction, as Seth uses it, at least tracks something of deontological significance. But I think Seth goes wrong with it in two ways. First, he uses a counterfactual test that does not work. Everyone in this room seems to be using it. Second, his comparative approach leads him to treat the two types of killings like ingredients in a hybrid act, failing to realize that what is deontologically relevant, and this came up, I think, in the first session a bit, but what is deontologically relevant is the presence or absence of a successful justification for action. If we clean up these problems, then we are left with a distinction that does not obviously help establish a threshold distinction. So part A, distinguishing opportunistic and eliminative killing and the counterfactual test. The distinction was originally introduced by Warren Quinn as a distinction between types of intentional killing. Seth says he thinks of the distinction in somewhat different terms. Okay? He says that eliminative killing can be unintended, as when people are killed as collateral damage from dropping a bomb on a target near them. By taking this position, Seth is shifting, this is my controversial read, maybe I can be shown to be wrong here. Seth is shifting to using the distinction as another label for what I call the means principle, namely the principle that it is harder to justify using someone as a means to harm a means to some end E without his consent and thereby causing him to suffer harm H, than it is to justify causing H without his consent as a side effect of pursuing E. Opportunistic killing takes advantage of the opportunity to use someone as a means without his consent, while eliminative killing eliminates the person without using him as a means of achieving some good, and thus it maps onto killing as a side effect. Seth does not say much to explain why opportunistic killing should be worse than eliminative killing. He emphasizes that my paper's been printed twice. He emphasizes that if you opportunistically kill another, you actually use her. But this simply repeats the definition. He also says your action, quote, draws a benefit from the harming which the beneficiary could not have enjoyed in the absence of the victim. This is suggestive, but it doesn't go beyond that. Why should drawing a benefit from the presence of a victim matter? If we're focused on the strength of the victim's claim, as I think we should be when reasoning deontologically, as in focus on the victim, not the agent, it's not clear why his claim not to be harmed should be stronger just because you benefit from harming him. Assuming that we're not worried about incentivizing harm, we're not sort of slipping in a consequentialist justification, how does your benefiting from his presence disrespect him more than if your harming him leaves you no better off than you would be if you were absent? I basically think this challenge can be met. There's a good reason to think that the means principle is basically on the right track because it tracks fairly well what I have called the restricting claims principle. So for those of you who haven't heard this, let me tell you about the restricting claims principle. The restricting claims principle holds that it is easier to justify causing harm to someone with a restricting claim than a non-restricting claim. The distinction of, the direction of normative work is important. The thought is that a restricting claim pushes, meaning it exerts a normative force, to restrict an agent relative to her background freedom of action. In doing so, it pushes to make those who would benefit from that action worse off than they would otherwise be. By contrast, a non-restricting claim does not push to restrict an agent relative to her baseline freedom. Thus, it would not push to make others worse off than they would be if the agent were able to act on her baseline freedom. Restricting claims are weaker than non-restricting claims because only the former push to make others worse off against the relevant baseline. The difficult problem for the restricting claims principle is defining what an agent's baseline freedom is. When I first proposed the RCP, the restricting claims principle, I followed the same counterfactual baseline that Seth uses as the distinction between opportunistic and eliminative killing. As he puts it, the idea of opportunistic agency uses a counterfactual. You derive a benefit from harming the person that you would not have enjoyed in her absence. This counterfactual test has to involve something like a closest possible world test. As Seth rightly points out, It does not involve asking what would happen if the person with the claim never existed. That can introduce all sorts of differences that are not only irrelevant, but radical. It could include making it impossible for the situation in question to arise at all. Rather, it involves imagining that, quote, your potential victim disappears, vanishes. One wants to add poof.
Someone wants that.
But of course, she cannot vanish in a way that disturbs anything else. If she literally went poof, there would be thunderclaps as the air rushes in to fill the void. People shouldn't die of shock or faint of shock from seeing a person magically disappear. Rather, as much as possible, we are to imagine that everything goes on as it would if the person smoothly, non-shockingly got out of the way. So the problem with this baseline is that the counterfactuals sometimes give you the wrong answer, even if we describe them to bring them about with optimal clarity. So elsewhere in a paper that Victor's still sitting on, Victor,
Sorry.
I discussed.
There's so many mistakes that it's hard to get through it all. That's the worry. I'm on page 2. It's taking me days.
I discussed the problems with the counterfactual test in this paper that Victor is sitting on at some length, both with counterexamples and a theoretical discussion. Here, I'll demonstrate the problem with one of Seth's examples, one that he offers to pump the intuition that eliminative killing is not as wrongful as opportunistic killing. Quote, suppose I kill an enemy soldier who's rushing at me with a bayonet. I'm no better off by killing him than I would have been had he not been there, end quote. Seth thinks the fact that I am no better off shows that I am not making positive use of his presence, and therefore that I make no opportunistic use of him. This should make such an act of self-defense easier to justify, say, than grabbing a small bystander and using him as a shield, knowing that he would then die from bayonet impalement. In the human shield case, if we assume that I have no other way to defend myself, then if I use him as a shield, I make myself better off than I would otherwise be if he were to vanish. There are many problems with this counterfactual analysis, problems that can be brought out by considering deviant counterfactuals. Suppose, for example, that in the nearest possible world in the bayonet case, there's a sniper who's about to shoot me with a pellet containing a horrible disease. It would kill me, but only after I first had a chance to spread the disease to my comrades in arms, and then it would kill many of us. Moreover, the death would be a gruesome death for all of us. But as it turns out, one of the sniper's fellow soldiers has charged me with a bayonet. If he would just trip and get out of the way, the counterfactual, then the sniper would shoot me. As it is, however, he blocks the sniper until he's fairly close. Once he's fairly close, too much time has elapsed, the sniper has gone back into hiding, and I'll be safe from the sniper. Moreover, if I wait until the soldier with the bayonet is fairly close, I'll be able to take a reliable shot at him with my pistol, making me safe from him as well. In other words, in this case, I would be worse off if the man with the bayonet were to vanish before I shot him than if he remained on his present course. This seems to indicate, using Seth's reasoning, that in this counterfactual condition I make opportunistic use of him, and thus should find it harder to justify killing him than in the normal case. That is, it seems to indicate that I should treat this case more like making use of a human shield. But that would be plain wrong. It's true that I'm better off because he is present than I would be if he were absent, but that cannot ground some special claim he would have not to be killed by me. It's not as if I owe him any debt of gratitude for blocking the sniper. He's not doing so on purpose, nor am I using him for that purpose. I'm simply accidentally benefiting from his presence. I would presumably owe him a debt of gratitude if he were not trying to kill me. But as it is, that's what he's trying to do, and insisting on gratitude would be quite odd. And even if in some attenuated sense I owe him a debt of gratitude, it would certainly not be so great as to make killing him wrong in a way resembling the wrongness of using a human shield. A similar problem occurs in the reverse direction for the human shield case. Suppose counterfactually that I could just as easily defend myself from the enemy with a bayonet by tossing a grenade at him while he's still a bit further away, thereby temporarily incapacitating him, saving my life, but killing an innocent bystander as a side effect. No, I do not improve my situation by using a human shield. I could have been just as safe in another way. This would seem to make my use non-opportunistic, merely eliminative. That can't be right either. What must matter, if the means principle is at all morally defensible, is that I still use the human shield as a means without his consent. An alternative to the counterfactual test, one that avoids these sorts of counterexamples, sets the agent's baseline with reference to what she owns or is basically free to use, what I've called her toolbox. Non-restricting claims concern the property, whether it's the first property, the body, or the second property, other stuff that people own, of another. So, non-restricting claims concern the property of another. The thought is that it does not restrict an agent relative to her baseline freedom to prevent her from using what belongs to another. The property claims of others limit what an agent's baseline freedom is. What does restrict your baseline freedom is letting the claims of others not to be harmed limit what she can do with what is already in her toolbox. I have a footnote, and I'm generally not reading my footnotes, but I'm going to expose one for a moment. So Seth objects to a property notion, referring to Jonathan Kwong's use of it. He says he's skeptical that property rights are relevant to the ethics of killing. When life and death are at stake, property rights must pale in insignificance, he says. And I say this misunderstands the role of property rights. Of course, one's interest in maintaining one's property pales when compared to one's interest in maintaining one's life. And a claim not to be killed that's based on a property claim will be stronger than one that's based merely on the interest itself. No one would deny, for example, that it would be much harder to justify taking my medicine that I rely on to preserve my life, to save the lives of 2 others, than to give medicine that belongs, say, to a pharmacy, to 2 people rather than me, assuming we all needed to live. That's just one illustration. There could be many where property makes a difference to the strength of the claim. Okay, so notice how the toolbox baseline helps with the counterexamples. When one is not manipulating another, then even though one gets a benefit from him, as in my example, the soldier with the bayonet blocking the sniper's shot, one's freedom is not at stake, and the distinction between restricting and non-restricting claims is not engaged. What matters is whether I have the means to protect myself in my toolkit. I'm going to hold off on saying whether I do or not in that case. Accidentally benefiting from another's presence would rarely affect that. That's the point I want to make at the moment. Likewise, we get the human shield case right. No matter what my other options are, the child's body is not part of my toolkit, and thus his claim on me, his claim that I refrain from using him as a shield, is non-restricting. Okay, that was long. It was a diversion, but I think it's important to get that out there. And one way it pays off is in the application of just war theory. So let's start on that one. So Seth uses the categories of opportunistic and eliminative killing to suggest that, quote, intentionally killing civilians is generally more opportunistic than intentionally killing soldiers. And killing soldiers almost always involves an eliminative dimension. For example, Seth reasons that killing soldiers might be part eliminative insofar as the enemy cannot fight without them, but part opportunistic as we communicate to the enemy's leadership by killing their forces, quote, that the costs of continuing to fight outweigh the expected advantages of doing so. I've just already given us a reason to think maybe that's not opportunistic, but sorry, that's quite the yawn there, Joe. This paints the picture of a hybrid act, justified with a hybrid justification that might be easier to justify than a different kind of hybrid act of killing non-combatants. That's clearly the way Seth was talking about it in the first session, too. So the first problem with this picture is that justifications should be analyzed in as fine a grain as possible. If it's possible to justify an act using one morally sound justification, then the act is permissible. If the justification requires appeal to multiple factors, so be it. But one cannot taint a successful justification by appeal to the fact that one could also offer a morally unsound justification for the same act. So if it turns out that a full justification of an act can be obtained in eliminative terms, then the act is permissible, even if it also serves other opportunistic ends. The hybrid picture that Seth paints just muddies the water. Now, you might think this muddying is inevitable if intentions, which often reflect multiple reasons, were of primary deontic significance. But I assume, as I said earlier, that we want a patient-focused deontology, and intentions, being agent-focused, should not normally be our primary deontic concern. They may make a first-order difference to what's permissible if patients have a right that agents act on certain intentions and not others. But that will rarely be true in the context of a war. possible exception, the crime of perfidy. Okay, so that's one point. The structure of the hybrid justifications is, I think, illicit. Second point is that Seth's analysis of targeted killing as often eliminative is itself misguided because of his mistaken use of a counterfactual baseline. He writes, for example, quote, "Killing civilians can diminish the adversary's productive capacity, so one is not profiting from their presence, but eliminating their contribution to the enemy threat." This eliminative reading of the killing of non-combatants misses the real action. Their deaths are not side effects of stopping the adversary's productive capacity. And that's why I'm reading eliminative as a moral synonym of side effect. Of course, non-combatants are sometimes killed as a side effect of targeting things like a factory in which they work. But if one targets them, it's ludicrous to consider their deaths the moral equivalent of side effects, mere collateral damage. The example that Seth did use to introduce the concept of eliminative killing. Killing the civilians when you're targeting them is the means by which one stops the adversary's productive capacity. It's more apt to say that killing them is a form of opportunistic agency in which we put them in our toolbox as things we can manipulate to achieve an end. They are not, however, rightly viewed as part of our collective toolbox. Thus, we should think of their claims as non-restricting and very strong. Unless they are liable to be harmed, they may not be targeted. Okay, so I don't deny that there might be some way to use these deontological categories of eliminative and opportunistic killing to establish the threshold distinction. If I have the time, how long have I been going?
We've got about 7 minutes.
Okay, I think I may get there. Okay, then I'm going to spend 6 minutes on that in the conclusion. But I do want to say that the structure of the argument that Seth has given us is not going to get us there by itself. I'm going to basically skip part 4 in risky killing. I'm going to say just 30 seconds on it, which is that the risky killing thesis is clearly comparative, and it's not going to do to establish the threshold distinction that I think we're looking for. Okay, so let me get to my self-indulgent conclusion of the 4-part suggestion. So, step 1. Let's focus on non-combatants. I suggest that most non-combatants in countries that fight unjust wars are not morally responsible enough to be liable to targeted killing. This despite Cheney's discussion of total war. Maybe, where's Cheney? Oh, there, right. Maybe in a total war context it'd be different, but I'm not so sure. But the thought here is that normally they lack the level of liability to be targeted because of a combination of highly attenuated causal connection between their actions and the ability of others to wage an unjust war, and the cost to them of avoiding doing things that have some indirect tendency to support others in waging an unjust war. My paradigm case is of people engaging in normal economic activities that are not focused on waging war, but that produce goods, ranging from food to fuel, that are useful to those who engage, who wage war. Their claims not to be killed as collateral damage could be outweighed, however, if the good achieved by fighting the war is high enough, or to which I may get a chance to return if there's time. Okay, step 2. Some combatants can be killed as threats because one is targeting the threat, not them. This is a kind of wacky idea which I've got on the handout under a theoretically innovative move.
Gold star, 1.
All right, I want to try on the time. Let's say, innovative doesn't mean good. It could mean crazy. Okay, so this applies. So, how can they be targeted as a threat? 2 ways. 1, it's fairly non-problematic extension of killing justified as collateral damage. When, for example, they're the pilot of an airplane is dropping bombs, you shoot the airplane, they happen to be in it, collateral damage. Despite what the German Supreme Court said, that was a wacky decision. 2, the tank crew, right? Driving the tank's shooting things up, okay, go for the tank, people in the tank die. Collateral damage. But, what about the case of the soldier in the field with a gun, right? You're not gonna shoot the gun, you shoot the soldier. So I think you can make sense of that case as targeting a threat too. Here's how. Ask the question, how are combatants related to the threats they themselves pose? We can answer that question in two ways. Looking at them as agents, they're responsible for those threats. But suppose, at least for the sake of argument, that they are generally insufficiently culpable to be so liable for the threat they pose that they may be targeted for killing qua agent. We could, however, also look at them as patients, beings who have been thrust into the role of being a threat. Even if they are innocent aggressors, we can treat them as analogous to innocent threats. The essence of an innocent threat is that he's like a passenger on board a threat, one that happens to be his body. I think we can stretch the analogy further and say that innocent aggressors are also like passengers on their bodies, bodies that are like an airplane that has been weaponized. If we go after their bodies as the threats, the claims they have not to be killed are like the restricting claims of passengers on a weaponized airplane. This gives us a model then for being able to target certain combatants, those who pose a direct threat to others, much as we justify causing collateral damage to non-combatants. This raises the question of whether non-combatants who do things that causally support the ability of a country to wage an unjust war can likewise be targeted qua threats. I think the answer is no. There's a gap between them and the threats to which they contribute. They are not the threats themselves. They more or less innocently facilitate threatening. As I said in the earlier section, their targeting cannot be considered a side effect of going after the threats. It is rather a means of doing so. So taking stock. We've now established the two poles of threshold distinction, a group of non-combatants who may not be targeted, and a group of combatants who may. Even if they're not liable to be targeted qua agents, be targeted as patients insofar as they are or are in threats that may be targeted. This leaves, however, two large groups of people to consider. One, combatants who are members of the military, members of the military, who are not themselves threats. Right? You know, the guy who works at the logistics office in the back or something, right? And two, the non-combatants who are equally involved in directly supporting the military in its efforts to wage unjust war. So I think I'm about out of time, so let me just say this about that, and then I'll wrap it up. Actually, there's a juicy paragraph here I can't skip. Here's what I want to say, and I'll give you the juicy paragraph, and then I'll wrap it up. I think it may be the case that those people can be liable enough to be killed or not liable enough to be killed. But notice they are the essence of the people in Lazar, in Seth's overlap hypothesis. So my suggestion here is that lumping combatants and non-combatants in this group is not a problem. It's morally appropriate. So in some sense, it gets to Cheney's point, right? So revisiting Seth's argument, it would not be, quote, radically undermine the protection of non-combatants in war, since the number of non-combatants in this group is reasonably limited. It also would not leave us without legitimate means to fight otherwise just wars, another quote from that passage, as direct threats and non-human military targets could be targeted, collateral damage could be justified, and if people in this group can be targeted, because they're sufficiently liable, then quite a few people who aid in waging an unjust war can be attacked. So that's where I'll stop.
Okay, so thank you very much, Alec, for that. Lots going on, and I won't try to address all of it. I'll just kind of try and run through and pick up the bits where I think I can add something useful before we open up to discussion. On pacifism, it's a really important part of, and this sort of relates to some other things, it's a really important part of what I'm trying to do, that I want to defend a principle of distinction that is neutral as to whether you're fighting overall justly or unjustly. I think that's the kind of distinction that exists in sort of the most people's understanding of the ethics of war, and that's the one that I sort of set out to defend. So in a way, for me, it's not that I'm assuming that pacifism is false. I'm making arguments that are consistent with pacifism being either true or false. If pacifism is true, then it's still really important that we retain the principle of distinction in the form that it currently exists, in the form that I defend, because still we want to be able to say that even if nobody ought to be fighting, those who do fight do more wrong by targeting civilians than by attacking soldiers. In terms of what I do to sort of argue against pacifism, I have some other stuff, which is really not part of this book, but I have some other arguments in favour of why pacifism can be overcome. But I do genuinely think that, and I think the phrase I always use on this is that pacifism should be a live option. I think that you can't justify warfare solely in terms of it being a case of harming people who are liable to be harmed. So there has to be a lesser evil justification for the intentional killing that occurs in war, at least some of it. And so on that basis, there has to be a lesser evil justification for warfare if war is going to be justified. So the only thing that I'm sort of committed to in that area is just that liability alone won't do the trick. And I think we probably don't disagree about that. The point about, there's quite a few points that just relate to how we have just different pictures of how to do normative ethics. And I suspect that some of the disputes between us are terminological, some of them are substantive. The general idea that I have of kind of how rights work and how pro tanto wrongfulness is relevant to all things considered justification. I said it out in the book, and the idea is just that the more seriously pro tanto wrongful a given violation of a right, the harder it is then to come by an all things considered justification. I think that's something that is quite widely endorsed, and so I'm kind of happy with my side of the debate there. I suspect that there's a certain amount that could be recast in the terms that you want to cast it, but then on the other hand, I really do think that when you harm civilians as collateral damage in the pursuit of an otherwise justified end, that they are wrong. They have a complaint against you that is overridden. I don't think that the presence of an all things considered justification that overrides a right makes it the case that the right no longer applies. I think this has the usual kind of tests for this. You think that it's appropriate to have some sort of compunction towards them, that sometimes compensation might be appropriate in circumstances after these conflicts. But those are things that I think, again, it's probably just a really big divide within how you think about the role of rights. So onto the counterfactual test. So here's this imaginary longer book that keeps coming up in these discussions. So in the earlier drafts of the book, I had much more stuff on the limited administrative agency and limited opportunistic agency, and I talked about all this kind of factual stuff. In the end, I decided that those sort of details became distracting when I think that the central points that I want to make really do apply whether you hold my view of this distinction, or I think probably your view, or John Pong's view. And I say at the end that I don't want to get too wedded to a particular account of this. Like you agree that there's clearly something in the area that is significant. I think that the particular deviant counterfactual case. So Christian has given me an example of this case a long time ago in response that was written to some papers by Gerhard. And I don't think I've ever had an adequate kind of response to it. I think they're tricky. I don't think that they undermine the basic underlying idea. And as to what the basic underlying idea is, I don't know that there's a huge amount more that we can say about why it's wrong to use a person than that it's wrong to use a person. And I think that saying that it's wrong to treat them as being part of our toolbox doesn't add an extra layer of justification underneath the using part, although it's a nice metaphor.
Read the paper.
Yeah. So I really don't mind that level of disagreement. I think that stuff doesn't have bearing on the case on the application. So then it comes to the application. And here I think that this was really, the discussion in the first session was really helpful in terms of thinking about these sort of hybrid acts. And there's three things that I think are really important and that I wasn't sufficiently clear about or hadn't even thought of. It's really hard to be very clear about something that you haven't yet thought. So the first thing is the point about there being different agents. So the people who do the killing will typically have limited intentions in war because they're trying to kill people who are trying to kill them. And the fact that there is this overarching strategic objective of persuading the adversary to give up, that's something that doesn't change the fact that the actual killings themselves are somewhat less wrongful in virtue of being limited. Second point is one Massimo raised, the sort of predominance of these reasons in the agent's mind. I think that's also important. And there's a further point that Jeremy made as to the sort of proportionality between what you're trying to do and the harm that you're inflicting. I think all of these are relevant, but it's worth saying at the outset that I don't view the appeal to the limited opportunistic agency distinction as being a sufficient basis for justifying a permission to kill in one-to-one cases. Right, so I say this in the book that I still don't get why it's okay to kill the falling fat man. For all that's been said, I think that there's it's not as bad to kill him as to use him, but it's still bad. There's still this big presumption that you have to overcome. It's still only a one-to-one case as far as the interests go. So with all of these things, when we're talking about eliminatively killing combatants who are innocent, and that's the key category, none of these things are going to be justified solely in virtue of their eliminative effects. So then you're not going to get the sort of objection that you raised to the situation where if something is justified on an eliminative basis, then the opportunistic stuff can't make it worse. And that goes to the sort of things that Victor was saying in his question at the start of the first session. And like I said there, I'm not 100% sure on how to work out the details, but as far as the application as I'm using it goes, the key thing is that none of this is sufficient, that the eliminative considerations alone are not sufficient to render it permissible to kill an innocent combatant. There has to be, for the people who are pursuing a just cause, there has to be an overall less legal justification that factors in all good. And then for the people who are pursuing an unjust cause, then obviously for them, it's all things considered wrong. And the question is just how wrong it is. And so I think it's less wrong in that case than if they're killing someone in the sort of spectacular way that you get in the killing of Dan and Pearl that I described. So on the application to war, I think that the stuff I did on actually looking at killing of civilians in war and when it is strategically effective really does suggest to me that in most circumstances, there isn't a limited dimension. The claimed advantages, the claimed advantages for opportunistic killing of civilians, actually are the ones that are kind of least plausible. So this is the whole sort of lesson of Robert Pape's research on strategic bombing, that when you try and use total war to break the will of the adversary, what you tend to do is just make them come together more cohesively around their state, because their state is the only one that's actually protecting them from being bombed. Right, so that side of the opportunistic harming of civilians, I don't think has a huge role to play. Whereas on the other hand, when civilians are the water in which the rebels swim, then you can harm them in the course of, and by removing them, you're not deriving a benefit you wouldn't have had in their absence. So I think that there is that limited dimension, and I think in long drawn-out wars of attrition, if you're taking people out but otherwise be producing weapons, then that is eliminated. And I say this regretfully because I would much rather this was a clean distinction. I just don't think that the actual, the research at least that I read on when it's effective supports that view. And then on the last point, I think that the thing you're describing at the end, I didn't follow all of it, so maybe we'll get a chance to talk about it more. But the thing that it certainly won't do, and which is something I really am aiming to do, is to give this a counter-moral distinction that is neutral as to overarching ends. So that applies whether everybody is fighting unjustly or only one side is fighting unjustly. I think that that's the kind of the target of the book, is to give an account of that. And I don't think that the alternative you offer should do that, but it may be interesting independently.
Yeah. Okay, so just a few words, I guess, in reply. So I think we actually do agree on quite a lot. And I started.
So that means you're just as wrong as me then.
Oh, no, as I said at the beginning of the paper, I basically accept your arguments about which kind of killing is generally worse.
Okay.
My worry is you can't take that to establish what I took to be your ultimate aim, which was that, and maybe you just want to disclaim this as your ultimate aim, that we can say that it's permissible to go after the combatants, and it's impermissible, generally, these are all generally statements, but generally impermissible to go after the non-combatants. Worse than doesn't have anything to do with, whether you're over the threshold or not. And that's, even in your response, I didn't get an answer to that.
No, I forgot to actually respond to that, so just
Okay.
So, yeah, fair enough, and I'm not trying to do that. I think that this is, I think, the best that you can do with just moral philosophy alone, not in general, but I think the best we can hope for as a principle to defend. From what I've read and tried to do, I can't see a more robust version of the principle than moral distinction. And I don't think that's going to translate directly into international law and the actual prohibitions that you get there, and I think that there are issues we can talk about with that. As to whether it can make the difference between permissibility and impermissibility, yeah, I think it can, because I think that, look, it makes a difference in an all things considered justification how wrongful the acts are. But will that, it's not going to produce a general, it's impermissible to target civilians, permissible to target soldiers, because it is a comparative justification. So, you know, if you have a situation where the good you can achieve is great enough.
Okay, good. So then that sharpens the dispute here, because I think my concern is that when you're dealing with opportunistic killing, you really can't appeal to the lesser evil justification unless you've got liability established. So, you know, I think lesser evil works in the context of dealing with people who are harmed as a side effect, but it doesn't work, particularly when you're dealing with significant harms. I mean, I think you can use lesser evil to justify causing minor harms to prevent great harms when the person's used as a means without his consent. I'll buy that. But there's a threshold beyond which I think you can't justify. You go, you're just wronging the person.
Let me just give,
Yeah.
okay, the very, very smallest thing is just that
Very, very small.
the key point is that one of the aims of the book at the same time is to show ways in which killing of innocent combatants is less seriously wrongful than the worst kinds of wrongful killing. And so it just, I mean, I don't believe in these sort of thresholds anyway. But the point is that each of these arguments can be taken to show that claim, and that would help to push us towards it being all things considered permissible to target.
Alright, so let's open up for general Q&A. I saw Shane first, so if you want to kick us off, everybody else keep your hands up.
Well, first of all, Alex, great discussion. I mean, generally, I mean, personally, I understand some of this a lot better when this started. Just a couple of comments. Seth, your view about attacking combatants might be too much an artifact of focusing on the bombing World War II case. Now, I don't have an absolute reputation of that, but I think people tend to think that because the bombing of Dresden did not have the impact that it did, that therefore attacking combatants does not have the impact of breaking the will of the enemy. I mean, attacking civilians, I'm sorry. Yeah, attacking civilians. And the Condrey case I would give was one I alluded to this morning, which is the starvation of Germans during World War I. There's no question that the starvation policy had a dramatic impact. In fact, the entire strategy of World War II was fought by Germany in part to head off the possibility of that happening again. So this is another place where we have to become empirical and look at, you know.
I guess that case.
Right, fine, okay. The other thing is, and this is related to, again, sort of as an empirical observation, provoked to some extent by what you said, Alec, most soldiers are not combatants. At the top of World War II, only 10% of American soldiers in World War II actually got near combat. Most soldiers are not combatants, and most soldiers do not die from combat. Historically, they die from disease. So this, again, is a worry about sort of thinking that if soldiers are being attacked or dying, that's a qualitatively different category. I actually liked what you said about pacifism, Seth. At first I was ready to be annoyed about it. But first of all, you said, I will assume for the sake of argument. And I like that because you didn't say we all know pacifists are idiots. But the other thing is that you put your finger on a real problem for pacifism, which is that it's true that pacifists think that killing non-combatants is worse than killing combatants. Victor wrote about this in the Vera Brittain, George Orwell. Vera Brittain was Britain's leading pacifist. She thought that was worse. I think it's a real challenge for pacifists to explain how both of those things can be true, how war can be totally wrong, and yet there are gradations of killing there. So I actually like very much how you approach that. Final remark, quick remark, just an observation, someone who's not worked with this distinction. I can see how the opportunistic eliminative distinction works in these one-on-one micro examples. But you know, when you turn to aggregates, you know, the Nazis thought that the genocide of the Jews was eliminative killing. They thought that they were just eliminating a threat. I don't see how that makes it any better than if it had been opportunistic killing. So I really wonder whether these things that are true on a one-on-one basis, in some sense, become true of the kinds of things we're talking about in the war. That's just a comment.
So, 3:30 on the first day, we've got to the Nazis.
That's late.
We've done well to hold on. Yeah, I mean, look, I think that in that last case, and this is something I do sort of say at various points in the book, that sometimes certain kinds of considerations can swamp other ones. And I think also, and this kind of relates, I think, to the point that Jeremy made after the talk to me earlier. It also matters if you're eliminating them in order to, avert a totally imagined threat to your sort of racial purity. That's kind of a different kind of, and this relates to Kim's example from before too. So eliminate if you genuinely believe there's a threat to your life, there's an actual threat to your life. That's kind of different from it just being eliminated in these other ways. And that's, I think, something that I really got from the first session and from your comments and from the questions there. On the bombing case, so I'm used to sieges, and I agree. I think that the sieges are clearly an example of kind of opportunistic bombing of a certain kind. I'm thinking of the aerial bombing, but it's not just World War II, it's not just Dresden. I mean, the cases that Haig includes are all the major instances of strategic bombing in the 20th century, and he doesn't find an example of one that had the intended effect. And he repeatedly finds examples of the effects being the reverse. If everyone gets bombed if your civilians all get bombed, then same as what happened in Britain, you'll get that spirit of the Blitz and, the
Japanese thought bombing Pearl Harbor was going to break the will of the American people. It did a bigger mistake than that in the history of warfare.
Yeah.
So there you go.
Yeah.
Nick.
Yes. So this is going to be maybe appropriately a sort of more of a 30,000 foot view. I guess it's like that area of program, but much of what Alex said motivates it. The assignment of the threshold does a lot of work in the book, I think, because it's first of all, well, among other things, the notion of whether killing is opportunistic depends upon the threshold, because it depends on whether someone constitutes a threat or contributes enough to constitute a threat such that killing that person could be eliminated, right? And so what it does ultimately is lead you to conclude that based on that threshold, most civilians are innocent in a sense, are not liable, right? Although you acknowledge that some could be, right? So the difference between you and Helen really is I take Helen as using a much lower sort of threshold, right? But you each acknowledge that there could be civilian liability in certain cases. And then where you ultimately end up seems to me to be motivated to some extent just sort of by purely pragmatic considerations, such that as a matter of statistical probability, the category of citizens is more likely to contain innocence than the category of combatants, such that in any given instance, the likelihood you're going to be killing an innocent person will differ depending upon which category you target. So that, to me, seems like a sort of concession to epistemic difficulties. And in that sense, that's what I mean when I'm saying it's pragmatic. But to some extent, it seems to me, Helen, you end up in the same place. Because you're saying because of the identification and isolation problems, we also should not target civilians. But you're saying in that instance that they are, a larger percentage of them are liable, but there are pragmatic reasons for not doing it. You're saying a smaller percentage of them are liable, but there are pragmatic reasons for not doing it. So, in one sense, you each end up at sort of more or less the same place. And I wonder if you would say if you were able to isolate, morally responsible civilians, it would be appropriate to target them. And you would say perhaps you would say the same thing, but you would say that that's less likely to happen. That is, if we don't have the epistemic difficulties. That's to me, it seems to me where the two of you would part company.
So I mean, I think that there are definitely ways in which Helen and I have similar starting points, and so each of us thinks that the other's reductio is their QED. And I think that you do. I think it is the logic. I think that she has taken the sort of view that the sort of family of views that Jeff and other people have to their logical conclusion. And I do think that the essential step is in positing a low threshold of responsibility for liability. And I think if we have a higher threshold, then we're going to get most non-combatants not being liable. And then it becomes a matter of, obviously the combatants are also going to be liable. Then it becomes a matter of whether both sides, sort of the high threshold and the low threshold views, are able to defend moral distinction. And I don't make a big deal out of this in the book, but it's something I mention in passing in a few places, that a few of the arguments that I use, they really help us distinguish between killing innocent civilians, killing innocent soldiers, but there wouldn't be much use for distinguishing between killing liable and liable on the same part. So that's particularly true for the vulnerability and defenselessness one. It may well be true for the risky argument, probably also true for the eliminative argument. So I do think that, that's a really important distinction, and it means that the kind of arguments that I adduce aren't available on a low threshold view to the same extent. On the other hand, I would welcome being refuted on that. I think that the goal here is to provide an account that preserves some protection for civilians that is defensible to as broad a spectrum of people as possible. And I think that there are ways you could adjust the argument so that so that Helen could take advantage of them as well. And I think also that the arguments in the combatant non-immunity section, all of those I think are available to the low threshold view. But then it's not just pragmatic. I think what it is it's pragmatic only in one sense, that there's these overlapping considerations, some of which apply in some cases, some of which don't, but when you sort of plot them out, you end up with a fairly robust protection for most civilians. The role of epistemic considerations in the discussion in the book is insofar as they pertain to objective permissibility. So that's the idea in the risky killing chapter, that taking greater risk, other things equal involved, when you do violate someone's right, ends up more seriously violating that right. I do think that you do need to appeal to pragmatic considerations to get you the principle of distinction as you find it in international law. I'm not an absolutist for one, so obviously I don't think it could be absolutely prohibited. I'm really not sure about the successive argument of the doctrine of double effect and arguments about the significance of intention. So those are two key parts of principle of distinction in international law that I think may end up just being justified on the basis that you need a rule that people can follow, and that people are crappy at making exceptions of themselves, so you should not allow them to. But morally speaking, since I'm not an absolutist,
Alright, so Alan, was yours finger or hand?
Well, no, it can be a
Okay, David, finger or?
Yeah, this is just a follow-up on this. So, but I take it that both opportunistic killing and risky killing work a lot worse with the low threshold view. Those arguments really don't go through, right? Or
I think that they could be. So I say that they can't. I think that there are ways in which they could. I just don't think it. So I didn't make those arguments because I don't have the low threshold view. But I can see ways in which you can say something along the same sort of lines. You'd have to say something like, when someone takes a risk with my rights, in the second case, the risky killing case, even when I actually don't have a right that they don't harm me, still they wrong me somewhat more in virtue of being reckless. And I say a little bit about that. I say something to that effect in the last chapter, where I talk about how even just combatants go to war recklessly, and so they don't robustly respect their adversaries' rights. So I don't think that's quite the same as the risky killing argument, because it isn't continuous in the same way, it's more modal. But I think it's something that is available to the other side.
So we started late, so we'll go to 5-2. I've got Victor, you're second, Arnold on the list. So Victor.
Thanks very much. So, when we think about the opportunistic and illustrative as you have it, one question is, what's the fundamental idea that's most important that lies behind this? And I think the most important idea is using is one view. Alternatively, using is just derivative of something else that otherwise you would have made me better off, or you would have made me worse off. And that's what and that just explains why we we think that using is important, but it's explained in virtue of this other set of things. And then to avoid these weird counterfactuals, you can just say, you caused me to be better off, you caused me to be worse off. And we know from preemption and overdetermination cases that causing doesn't rely on the simple counterfactual view that you described, so you can just adjust it to deal with Alec's kinds of cases. It's just a preemption case, and you just rule it out in that way. But there's the question whether that's the fundamental way. The fundamental idea, is it really wrong to use someone in virtue of the fact that otherwise they would have, that they would make you better off as a result? I just find that just mistaken as a way of thinking about the thing. The mere fact that they would have made you better off, that's the only thing that matters. That's really why using's bad. And when we eliminate the threats, because they would have made you worse off. So we could have used you if it would have made you worse. There's nothing special about using. We could use you to prevent the person making you worse off. Even if you were a non-responsible threat, that just gives using far too limited a role, I think. So that's why I think we should distinguish between opportunistic killing and manipulative, because I think the opportunistic thing has some moral force, but not enough, and then we have this other thing that's going on in those cases. So I just think more about the different ways in which we could underpin the thing, and then that's going to have implications in war too, because these things are going to come apart in different cases. And then on the property thing, so Alec had the thing with the heart pills, that it does look like your property is important there, and I think that's right. And I thought the way to think about this is to think about Dworkin and having a kind of ambition-sensitive idea. If I invest in something to protect myself in the future, then it would be wrong to use my property to protect someone else at the cost to me, where I could use the property because where they didn't spend the money on the relevant thing, because we want our property rights to be ambition-sensitive in this way. But we could imagine property which wasn't bought for that reason. So in Kwong's car case, for example, they don't buy the car to protect me from meteors. And so then we think, okay, it's okay that we might just flip a coin about who gets in the car in that case, or I have we need to get across a ravine, and we're near my garden. There's a trampoline in the garden that I bought for my kids, and they say, well, I'm allowed to use the trampoline because it's my trampoline. That's just irrelevant in that case. So that's why I thought you could find a way of reconciling your position. Say property is sometimes important when it fulfills this ambition-sensitive idea, but it's not relevant where it doesn't.
That was just very helpful. Don't really have anything to say.
Alright, good, great.
Easy though.
Seth, it seems that you are committed to more than the comparative claim in value for risk killing, because at a certain point you must argue that soldiers have a deliberative duty to distinguish between soldiers and civilians, and if they cannot, then they must hold fire, which means that they have, if they cannot distinguish between soldiers and civilians, they have to let themselves or others killed by the aggressor. And this, well, as far as I understood the argument from risk killing, this is an essential stage in the deduction.
So it isn't essential in that argument. It's a bit of a sidetrack, I think, because I give the other way of preserving the argument. But in terms of that view, I mean, the thing about that is that it's really much more like a principle of epistemic permissibility than it is to do with objective permissibility. So it's not really one that ties in with the rest of the view. I mean, I think that because the rest of the view is about objective permissibility. Yeah, I think it's kind of a different thing. As to, the basic claim would have to be something like, look, if you can't tell who they are, then the risk of them being innocent, if they're all innocent, then it's going to be objectively impermissible, then the risk is too great for you to proceed. But that would be a principle of subjective permissibility, of course.
It's a lesser risk than if you know that they are civilians. So if you cannot distinguish between soldiers and civilians, and you have no way to do that, then your evidential probability that they are innocent is lower. And according to you, in many circumstances, it might be a lesser evil to kill them indiscriminately.
Should we just take Simon's finger very quickly?
Yeah, no, just two three very quick points.
That better be a joke.
Yeah. Of course, from an international law perspective, where there's doubt, there's a presumption of civilian status. Nobody's made a point about that. Secondly, Seth, you talked in the introduction about precautions in attack and proportionality. You don't talk about precautions against attack. And there's an obligation under international law to remove civilians. Even if you're a legitimate threat, you're obliged to remove civilians from the co-location, so to speak, that threat is within. And then I think, on the point that Yishai was making, there's an obligation to distinguish yourself from civilians. So you have there's 3 points there, all of which I think need to be factored in if you want to correlate the position that you have in relation to how international law issues play out on this issue.
Yeah. So I mean, that's all fair enough. I think definitely true and appropriate as a matter of law. I mean, look, the thing I say there, I think, is that sometimes it would be permissible to kill even if you knew that they were all civilians. And in that circumstance, if you don't know, then it's okay to proceed. But I did argue for this notion that if you don't know who they are, if you can't tell who they are, then you should treat them as civilians. So I don't think that's inconsistent with the overall claim that this is a comparative point. It is more of a pragmatic principle, I guess, because it does have to do with decision making under uncertainty.
Okay, so Arnold and then Kristen.
Seth, maybe in your written reply to Alec, a few things that would, I think, just be generally helpful for your readers. So you say that when you take all these different considerations together, they overlap to such an extent that you get a robust difference between combatants and non-combatants. That's actually hard for the reader of your book to really verify because some of these ideas only apply to liable or non-liable people. So if you could in some way help the reader understand how these considerations stack up in which types of cases, so we know how big a difference we're really talking about. Such that either pragmatic principle, legal principle, some other thing would really be justified. The other thing that just conceptually might be worthwhile to talk about, so you're making a comparative claim, right, one's worse than the other. It might just be that these are just sort of two bodies floating in moral space, right? Or it could be that we have some intuitive notion of the presumptive wrongfulness of killing an innocent person, and some of these considerations make the killing worse than that, and some make it less bad than that. And in some cases, it's not necessarily clear. So the vulnerability point, is it that killing a vulnerable person is worse than killing a not especially vulnerable person? That's possible, right? So maybe killing a child or an old person is sort of even worse. Or is it that it's less bad to kill somebody who can kind of fight back a little bit or avoid harm? So maybe be a little more clear about whether that's a move you want to make or don't feel like you need to make.
Yeah, fair enough. So I mean, the thing I tried to say at one point is that it's really important to get a sense not only of there being this comparative difference, but also of the absolute moral significance. Actually, I think in response to a comment from you on an earlier draft of the book, get a sense of the absolute significance of how bad killing civilians is. And so there I really am, that it really is important that I have a high threshold for you there, because that's just the regular bad kind of killing. And then what I want to try to say is that basically, killing soldiers, killing even just combatants, it's not as bad as killing a just attacker, a just offender in an ordinary self-defense case. And actually, killing unjust combatants isn't as good, if you like, as killing an unjust attacker in an ordinary self-defense case. So there's a kind of movement between those two categories away from the sort of paradigm cases that we use. But I do want to be able to argue that basically killing civilians is the ordinary, very wrong kind of killing, and that killing innocent combatants, is less seriously wrong than that.
Okay, Christine, really quickly.
Yeah, I didn't want to. Victor doesn't get to win because
That ended with a session. Sorry.
I don't think that you should avail yourself of this offer of doing away with the counterfactual when it comes to eliminative, because I think a lot of the intuitive appeal of eliminative harming as having a special status comes from the counterfactual thing. So think of a simple type of case that that someone like Helen is really interested in when there's an obstructor, somebody sitting in the cave. Now, it really is powerful if I say, look, if you weren't here, you should take on some of this cost, because if you weren't here, I'd just be fine. Whereas if that person is just sitting on a much heavier person who, if they weren't there, this person would pop up. You can't say that.
I wasn't denying that.
I understand that. But
I'm saying it wasn't the only thing that was important.
I agree. No, I was just saying, and it's true that that person who's now sitting in the cave is the cause of this risk to you. Nevertheless, I think the idea that it's permissible to impose more cost on them, that they should take on more cost than otherwise than a bystander would, really gets a lot of its force from the fact not that they're just causally here, but that their presence gives rise to cost relative to things subtracted from the scene. So I think there's a cost in that.
I mean, I see the force of both sides, to be honest, and it's just something that I want to get, I want to think about more.
You don't need to think about it, it's
So
obvious.
this, I mean, I start from an assumption that Victor's wrong. Sometimes it's good to just make him shut up.
And agreeing is the way.
Agreeing is a good way to do that. I mean, all I said was that it was helpful. I think there's a ton of stuff there, and at this stage, I really don't want to get too much into it because I want something that's going to be kind of that I think that you and Victor would be able to agree on, and Alec. And I think that the application can be made in such a way that it's neutral across these different interpretations.
Alright, on that note of harmony, let's thank Alec and Seth.